My name is Bob Hormats, and it's my honor and pleasure to be the moderator of this evening's event. And from my point of view, it's particularly thrilling to have one of the very first events to honor the book that Joe Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes have written, which is The $3 Trillion War, available outside. And what's important about this book is, first of all, the quality of the scholarship of the book itself, and second, the timeliness of this book. Joe and I had the opportunity this very morning to testify before the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, and there is obviously an enormous amount of interest in the subject that Joe and Linda have written about in this book. And we're going to have an opportunity to do two things. One, to hear from them, and then to hear from an expert panel with a great deal of experience in various aspects of war finance and dealing with the war, particularly a number of veterans issues that relate to the war. So I will not spend a lot of time introducing the members of the panel. You have, I think, this little brochure in front of you, which goes through in greater detail the bios of the various participants. Let me just start out, first of all, by introducing our first two speakers. Linda Bilmes will speak first. Linda is a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard University and a renowned expert in government finance. And then Joe Stiglitz, whom I'm sure many of you know, is university professor here at Columbia and a Nobel Prize winner, and has written extensively about the war and a number of other issues. And this collaboration between Joe and Linda, I think, is particularly impressive because they both bring their talents and expertise to bear on what is a very pressing financial issue, but it's more than that. It's a political issue, it's a moral issue, it's an issue that really reflects the overall prioritization of resources within our government and within our country. And from the point of view of those of you who are students here, or the taxpayers of the next several generations, this is particularly important also because a large portion, indeed the entire war, is being financed by borrowing, and I'm sure Linda and Joe will discuss this. And what does that mean? That means that the current generation is shifting the cost to all of you. So I think it's important to pay particular attention to the nature of the war, and in particular from the point of view of this evening, how it's being paid for or not being paid for, as the case may be, because the implications are very direct on many of you. They're going to affect interest rates when you begin your careers or as you go through your careers, taxation, the allocation and availability of government resources. So this is a very relevant topic, not just from an academic and from a policy point of view, but it's a very important pocketbook issue for many people in this audience, in fact, everyone in this audience. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Linda. What we're going to do is this: each speaker will speak from the table, make it very relaxed, informal kind of dialogue, and then the other panelists, whom I will introduce just after Linda and Joe have spoken, will comment on some of what they've had to say or add some thoughts of their own. I will comment toward the very end, and then you will have a chance to answer questions. So we'll each speak for about 10 minutes. While the speakers are speaking, please think of some questions, because we'd like to have this be as informal and as open as possible. And if you can come up with some good questions or useful short observations, that would help to make this the kind of dialogue we would like for this evening. So without further ado, let me ask Linda to begin, and we will start the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Bob. Greetings to Columbia students, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. I wanted to start, a lot of my students have asked me, how did I begin to start studying the cost of the war? So I just wanted to kind of tell you the story to start off. I teach a class, a large class on budgeting and public finance, and one of the first things that we teach in this class is the principle of accrual accounting, the principle of understanding that the full costs of something, understanding that if you buy a car for $10,000, that the $5,000 that you pay up front in the first year isn't the full cost. You have to pay for that extra $5,000 that you still owe. And in my introductory budgeting class, a lot of my students started saying to me, well, and this was now 3 years ago, well, if we applied the same principle to the cost of the Iraq War, wouldn't it cost a lot more than we're hearing about? So I decided that I would start looking into this question, and from that sort of grew this large study into the cost of the war and the impact on veterans that you will hear about tonight. So I thought that before we even start, it's worth kind of going over the scale of the war. It's hard to know with all the numbers that you hear and see in the media just how big of an effort this is. We will be on March 19th in the 5th year of the war. There have been to date 1.65 million U.S. troops deployed. There have been in Iraq alone more than 4,000 fatalities, way more than 4,000 if you include Afghanistan. There have been more than 70,000 wounded, injured, or diseased, seriously diseased troops who have had to be medically evacuated from the theater. Of the people who have come home so far, which is about 750,000, about 1/3 of them have already applied for disability benefits because something has gone wrong and they have been disabled in some way through their experience. More than that, about 265,000 have already been treated in veterans' medical facilities. Of those, 100,000 have been diagnosed with a mental illness, about half of them with post-traumatic stress disorder. So when you start kind of looking at the scale of what is actually happening here, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers who have come home wounded, and a very large percentage of the population, which even if we leave Iraq in the short term, will certainly exceed 2 million troops who have actually been there. This is much, much larger than the numbers that you kind of see on a daily basis for deployments in the theater. Now, we start with that to start thinking about the costs of the war. The costs have grown steadily, year by year. In the first year we were in Iraq, the costs were $4.4 billion a month. The costs are now, just for Iraq, $12 billion a month. If you add in Afghanistan, it's $16 billion a month. It's hard to even understand how big those kind of numbers are. That's larger than the budget of the United Nations. It is larger than the budget of the Centers for Disease Control for over 3 years. It is close to the budget for the National Institute of Health. It's a significant amount of money that we are spending every month in Iraq. And when we think about the cost of the war, all of that money, which are sort of the cash cost of the war, is the tip of the iceberg. There is if you take all of those cash monthly expenditures to wage the war that we have expended over the past 5 years, that totals around $600 billion. But that is only one of 4 major costs of the war. The second major cost is the cost of long-term costs that we would need to pay even if we left Iraq tomorrow, which includes things like paying for medical care for wounded veterans, paying for disability compensation for wounded veterans, paying for replenishing, replacing all the military equipment that is being used up very, very rapidly, and paying to restore the military forces and the National Guards to their pre-war state of strength. A second major sort of cost area that's not counted in the top line is the fact that there are costs that are hidden elsewhere in the government. For example, in the regular defense budget, which has gone up cumulatively by $500 billion since the war began, there are many, many expenditures that are actually for Iraq. Now, it's actually very hard to find those because the way Congress appropriates the money, they appropriate it for things like repairs, and you don't know if that repair is in Kansas or in Iraq or in Kuwait. So you have to really do a lot of sleuth work to actually figure that out. But there is, we figure, probably another $150 billion of money that is hidden in the rest of government spending. A third cost, as Bob mentioned in his introduction, is the cost of the debt. We've borrowed all of the money that we have spent on the war so far, and that money will have to be repaid with interest, as well as interest on the interest, and the principal eventually repaid as well. Finally, there are economic costs, and these include both costs that the government doesn't pay but that someone pays. You know, for example, if a family member has to quit their job in order to take care of a disabled veteran, that's a cost that someone is paying but the federal government is not paying it. And there are macroeconomic costs to the overall economy. All of this together leaves us with a very expensive war, a war that we, being conservative, and in the process of doing this, Joe and I went back and forth about, with me always trying to be excessively conservative, and almost under any scenario that one can imagine, the minimum that it could cost is $3 trillion. So on that note, I will hand it over to Joe.
Okay. Well, as Linda said, on March 19th, this war will be the 5th anniversary of the war. It is already the second longest war after Vietnam that we have fought, and it is the second most expensive war after World War II. And that's important, adjusted for inflation. And that's important because one of the big issues is, can we afford it? One of the things that we emphasize is, and that came out very strongly in the hearings this morning, it's not that we can't afford it. Our economy is strong enough that it won't by itself necessarily bankrupt us. But there are huge opportunity costs. And one of the interesting things is that there's a new unit of measure that we've tried to introduce, which is what fraction of an Iraq war would solve any problem we could name. Or to put it another way, how many hours or days or weeks of fighting would be paid for by a particular, each expenditure. For instance, the President talked about this huge gap in our Social Security system, unfunded. You know, will the retirement program be there when you come to retire? Well, for about 1/6 of the cost of an Iraq war, you could put the Social Security system on sound financial basis for the next 50 or 75 years or longer. Meanwhile, we have created a new entitlement, an entitlement which they've earned, which is the cost of disability and veterans. This is the kind of accrued cost. That cost is the order of magnitude of $600 to $700 billion. And so while he was talking about these unfunded entitlements, he actually created a real gap in our future, you might say, balance sheet. In the discussion this morning, Senator Schumer showed a chart where he had a bar chart with $160 billion is what we're spending on the Iraq war, $200 billion in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq together, $12 billion a month. And he compared that with total spending in transportation and infrastructure in the United States. Transportation was around $59 billion. Total expenditures on children health care, $5 billion. And the President vetoed the CHIP program, the Children Health Insurance Program, saying we could not afford it. So we're talking about really a couple, maybe 10 days of the war would have funded this program for well more than a year. So you can go down the list. So one of the concerns is, the argument is, well, this is about national security. One of the issues is was this about national security? At the hearings, there was somebody who was a security expert, and he pointed out, this is, you know, he went through in a very forceful way. He said, if you were bin Laden, what would you have wanted the United States to do? To get trapped in a quagmire in Iraq that has nothing to do with the fundamental problems. And so that meanwhile, while we were fighting in Iraq against about weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, North Korea became a nuclear power. While we were fighting in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan was not finished, the problem is in Afghanistan has exploded and gotten much worse and now looks very intractable. So these are some of the critical cost aspects, opportunity cost. What I want to spend a few minutes talking about are the broader macroeconomic cost. There's people said there are two issues in this campaign. One of them is the Iraq War, the other one is the economy. But actually what we try to argue is actually there's only one issue. It's the Iraq War, because the Iraq War is really imposing large costs on the economy. And there are four categories of cost. The first is, because of the war had a very adverse effect on the price of oil. Some people at the beginning of the war, I could have mentioned this, at the beginning of the war, the Bush administration talked about the war costing maybe $50 billion. Larry Lindsay had said it might cost 100 to 200 billion, and for that slight moment of honesty, he was fired. Rumsfeld described it as baloney. Well, as I say, the costs have turned out to be much greater than that. One of the arguments that Larry Lindsay also said is it was going to be good for the economy because it would ensure a supply of oil. The fact is, of course, that at the time we went to war, the price of oil was $25 a barrel. Futures markets predicted that the price would remain at $25 a barrel. They understood that there was going to be new demands from China, India, but the expectation was that the supply would increase in tandem, and the supply would increase from the Middle East, which is the low-cost provider, very low cost of production. But of course, the thing that changed that equation was the Iraq War. And now we have price of oil 4 times that, close to $100 a barrel. That means we are sending, you can think of it that way, a lot of money to Saudi Arabia and to other oil producers, money that could have been spent or would have been spent here at home supporting the American economy. It's helping support the Saudi Arabian economy. It means, it explains why it is that when American financial institutions needed a bailout, it wasn't here that they turned, it was to the sovereign wealth funds elsewhere. The second point is that the expenditures on the Iraq War do not stimulate the economy in the way that expenditures back here would have done. Spend money on a Nepalese or Filipino contractor fighting and providing services in Iraq or to the Iraqi army, it doesn't provide the kind of stimulus to the American economy that an investment here in the United States would have done. Thirdly, there's the long-term opportunity cost. You would have, had you spent it on investments in infrastructure and education research, it would have had long-term benefits. The expenditures in Iraq do not have these long-term benefits. And finally, unlike any other war that we've ever fought, this war is totally financed by deficit borrowing. When we went to war, we already had a large deficit. The president cut taxes for upper-income Americans, meaning that the deficits only grew larger. In the aftermath of World War II, a lot of people got the impression that wars were good for the economy. But no economist really believes that today. Keynes explained how you can stimulate the economy in ways that have long-term productivity effects much better. You don't need a war to stimulate the economy. The puzzle was, as we were doing our work, was why wasn't the economy worse than it seemed? Our analysis suggested that the economy should really be pretty badly off. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on increased oil, all these other things. The question was why wasn't the economy, didn't it seem worse off than it was? And the answer actually was pretty clear. The answer was that we were flooding the economy with liquidity. Monetary policy was very loose. Regulation was very loose. This allowed Americans to borrow. It led to a housing bubble, and that housing bubble led to a consumption boom. The magnitude of this borrowing by households is hard to fathom, but in 1 year alone, a span of 12 months, the amount that was taken out of the houses that were soaring in price was $1 trillion. Much of that went into consumption. So while oil prices and the other things that I described were pushing the economy down, this profligate spending was pushing it up. But what was clear is this couldn't continue. We were living on borrowed money and borrowed time, and it was only a matter of time before a day of reckoning would come. Now, I think the Bush administration hoped it would happen after November of 2008, but it happened a little bit before that, and we are now facing the consequences, the economic consequences of the war.
Well, thank you very much. This is, I think, a very provocative set of initial presentations, and basically I think you have gotten the point that this war is very different from past wars for a variety of reasons, both in the nature of the war and the way it has been financed. And now we have three additional members of our panel who are going to discuss this and perhaps discuss it from a somewhat different perspective. One of the points that Linda and Joe have made and that was discussed this morning in the hearing is the enormous cost of paying for proper medical care for wounded veterans, of which there are very large numbers in this war, in part because of heroic medicine that has enabled people to survive wounds that they otherwise wouldn't have survived in past wars. But there is, as we have been discussing amongst ourselves, a moral obligation on the part of this country, and I would say an unfunded moral obligation of all Americans, whether they support the war or do not, to make sure that the veterans who've sacrificed so much in this war are given the proper treatment, proper medical treatment, as long as they need it, which for many may be the rest of their lives. So we're going to concentrate now to a degree in the next set of discussions on that issue and a number of others. To discuss this, we have three really superb contributors. Bobby Mueller, who's president of the Veterans for America, Dave Gorman, who's executive director of Disabled American Veterans, and Michael Massing, who writes for the Columbia Journalism Review and the New York Review of Books. They're again going to each speak for about 10 minutes and provide their perspectives, and then we will move to the next stage of the panel. Gentlemen.
Okay. I'm Bobby Mueller. I'm going to remind you of a story that I hope a lot of you have heard over the years already. If you put a frog in a pot of water and you heat the water up slowly to boiling, the frog is going to stay in the pot of water. If you were to take the frog and throw the frog into a pot of boiling water, poof, you jump right out. That's part of the game that's been played by this administration. They have purposefully obfuscated, confused, withheld information so that we do not really understand. We are in a pot of boiling water. It is criminal. The deceptions, the evasions, the withholding of information that this administration has consistently, over these years, put into play. There are so many angles to this scam that it would be impossible, mind-numbing in the relatively short amount of time tonight to review them. I urge you, get this book, read the book. There are so many layers to this thing. This is very, very complex, complicated dynamics and issues that we're addressing. I've been in Washington for 30 years working on these issues. I learned a lot reading this book. And believe me, I'm not an academic, I'm not an intellectual kind of guy, you know? So if I can get it, I guarantee you everybody in this audience tonight will get it. And I want to say, they're not going to praise themselves, that would obviously be inappropriate, but I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for a superb job. You have put together a story that is readable and that makes really, really difficult stuff to understand comprehensible. And I know the length to which you've gone to try and tease out what's behind the curtain and to get the information that in many cases for the first time has been presented here. So it is a service to this country. And I, as an advocate for 30 years in Washington, want to say I really recognize the heavy lifting that you've done, and it's extraordinary. So when I say, you know, read the book, I really mean it. Read the book. You know, there's a lot of different ways you can try and conceptually, you know, get your arms around what's going on here, but let me take 3 simple points. This is the first time in our country's history that we've gone into a war on the basis of a volunteer, and I say that in a very qualified way, military. We have had to pay a lot more to get people to come in to the military. You're probably aware of the fact that first-time recruits, first time coming into the military, are getting $40,000 enlistment bonuses. People in the military that have got particular skill sets to be retained are being paid up to $150,000 to re-enlist so that they don't go work for the other new component in the game, which are the contractors, which represent another major piece of this equation in the privatization of war. When you look at the cost of the military, it's around $400,000 for every single soldier we deploy. $400,000 to deploy a soldier. At some point, these numbers start to become real. Another consideration. I got a stepson. He's 42 years old. He's got 3 kids, a wife. Couldn't pay the rent. So what did my 42-year-old stepson do with his 3 kids and his wife? He joined the Army 2 months ago. He said, Bobby, it's the only way I can get medical care, get a place to live, get the kind of paycheck I need. This despite the fact that he'd been thrown out of the Army many years ago. Well, no problem there, Joe. We're going to upgrade your discharge. Oh, and those legal problems that you had, we're going to give you a waiver on that stuff. Ta-da! That's what we're doing. We got more people now without even high school diplomas than imaginable. We have felons in the military. We actually, he's called me and he said, Bobby, oh my God, I don't believe it. We got gangs in the military. I said, yeah, I know, Joe. I've been reading. I've been reading about the soldiers that have died because they've been killed in the initiation process into the gang, which requires the other gang members to beat the shit out of them, and they got carried away, and these guys died. What's going on in the military today, at the cost that it is to this country, is nothing short of mind-numbing. And I said volunteer army in quotes because a lot of the people that are being deployed into these war zones desperately don't want to be there. You've heard about stop-loss. You make an agreement. You're going to serve for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years of active military service. Guess what? Come the end of that contractual period, they say, you know what? We need your unit. You're going to be extended for another year, and you're going into the war zone. In many cases, again, we have people that have gone 4, 5, 6 times, despite the fact that the majority of people are married, have families. We're churning them. Then, if you join the military, you have actually in the fine print an 8-year obligation. So let's say you serve 5 years active military as you agreed to. We have a lot of these cases. People leave the military, they go back to their home community, they start business, they go to school, whatever. 2 years later, they get a letter in the mail. You're to report in 30 days. They say, what the hell are you talking about? Read the fine print of the contract. You have an 8-year vulnerability, and right up until the end of that 8th year runs out, we can call you back. Individual ready reserves are being reactivated. So it's a volunteer army in quotes. The contractors, I think you've probably heard enough about it by now. Blackwater, the extraordinary fees that are being paid, over 100,000 contractors, over 100,000 in Iraq today. And I want to go back to the veterans piece. You know, I know that numbers tend to lose meaning. And Linda said it, or Joe said it, but I want to say it again. In their book, they lay out 3 different models. A very, very, very conservative cost estimate, a moderate, realistic cost estimate, and something that might be, because of the open-ended nature of what we're involved in, you know, a heavier cost estimate. The realistic estimate on what we've already incurred is that looking at the veteran community, and remember there's over 1.65 million different men and women that have served already, that what we can easily project in terms of disability payments to the veterans in this country is going to be $388 billion. The necessary medical care, $285 billion. You put that together, folks, we already incurred the obligation for $683 billion to deal with the results of this. That's more than the first 5 years of the war itself have cost us. I could go on and on. For your sake, I won't. It's in the book. There are layers to this thing. Read the book, please. Thank you.
I wish I had gone first. It's going to be a little bit difficult to follow that, but let me try to do it from a maybe a little similar but a little different perspective, too. My name's Dave Gorman. I'm with the Disabled American Veterans, and I would say up front that as a nonprofit advocacy organization of a little over 1 million veterans who themselves, men and women, were disabled during a period of military service, we won't stand up or sit up here and take a position on the war as an organization. I think we all have our own personal opinions about that, and we're going to deal with those, I suppose, in November, as we did November 4 years ago, that didn't bear any fruit. But be that as it may, I want to, I'm going to try not to be repetitive, but there are two things I do want to repeat. And the first is what Bob had to say as an introduction, that there is a pretty much an under the water, under the surface moral obligation, I think, that this nation has for its warriors. No matter how one feels about the justability of this war, if you're for it or against it, there has to be a moral obligation to honor those who are willing to put on the uniform, put their lives on the line to support our way of life, our freedoms, our democracies. Veterans have done that since the colonies in this country. They've been well rewarded and well recognized for that over the years. But as we get into this period, that recognition and that rewarding of their sacrifice is diminished, and it's diminished to a deplorable degree. The other thing I would repeat is from an organizational standpoint, and I've been in Washington since 1975, just a little bit longer than Bobby, although I probably look a lot older than he does, doing this kind of work, and that I have never seen the kind of not only eye-opening, but door-opening kind of work that this book is going to produce in the veterans community and hopefully in the halls of Congress and the administration. It's always been known what the cost of war is. What seems to be off the radar screen is that when that last shot is fired in hostilities, there are a number, and depending upon the period of war and the length of it, it depends upon the number that we're going to see of men, and today, increasingly more so, women, who are coming out of combat situations disabled. Although the war may end, and a lot of people may go back to what they were doing before, or not even notice that the war has ended, these men and women are going to be suffering each and every day for the rest of their lives with these kinds of debilitating, severe, and sometimes catastrophic disabilities. Not only will they suffer, their families will suffer, their quality of life will suffer, their potential as far as earnings and employment and success may suffer. Although veterans as a cohort have been shown to be more productive, more reliable, more team-oriented, and all those kinds of things as far as employment activity is concerned, if they can, in fact, get a job. Let me talk a little bit from a veteran's perspective. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I'm a combat disabled veteran. I've used the VA healthcare system and been a beneficiary of the VA benefit system since 1969. And I would say to you that it is a good system, and it's a system worth saving. I would also say to you that the United States government and our policies, our foreign policies, create disabled veterans. They're not created by Ford Motor Company, or they're not created by IBM, so they shouldn't be the responsibility of anybody other than a grateful nation. And that's where we're lacking, and that's where this work, and contained in the pages of this book, point to reforms, shortcomings in the system, and potential reforms to this system that can benefit disabled veterans. Are any of you veterans in the room? I would imagine that you know a veteran. I mean, your mom, your dad, your brother, sister, or uncle, or whatever. About a third of this nation is impacted by veterans. I mean, they're either comprised of veterans or their family members are veterans. We, again, owe the moral obligation to take care of them, and that has not been done. There is a quagmire, and you may have read about a little over a year ago about the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. that blew up in the face of the administration and the administration both in the medical center and the White House, and they reacted to that. They've reacted in a way that is just that. It's reactionary. It doesn't necessarily take into consideration what's best in the best interests of disabled veterans. I don't know the figures, and I think they pointed out in their work, but I know that the figure today for this war is that for every individual, for every soldier killed, or for every 16 wounded, there's 1 killed. So the survivability rate on the battlefield today is far, far greater than it was in Vietnam, which I think was something like 3 or 4 to 1 ratio. That means more and more severely disabled veterans are coming out of this conflict. More and more severely disabled veterans are going to have to face a lifetime of reliance on a healthcare system that's designed to take care of them and to take care of their needs. That's where the system has fallen short. That's where the authors of this work put together recommendations that we believe is going to allow the government to do that. I would think that if someone came up to you on the street and asked if you thought the government takes care of its wounded veterans, you would probably say, well, hell yes they do. And the fact of the matter is they don't. Veterans wait months sometimes for their medical appointments. They wait not only months, and oftentimes they wait years to get the disability and the educational benefits that they're entitled to. Following World War II, a veteran could come out and go to a university like this and have their entire education, tuition, books, and fees paid for by the GI Bill. Today, if it pays 1/3 of that, they would be lucky. So these veterans are already behind the curve. There are recommendations in this book, if you choose and have the opportunity to read it, and as Bobby said, I hope you certainly do, that take us to a new era of a GI Bill that honors veteran service, which we should do, and takes care of brings them into parity with their predecessors as far as benefits are concerned. The healthcare system is at the whims of the political process. VA never gets enough money to do with what they have to do. Many disabled veterans go without medical care simply because the government has not seen fit to put a process in place that can give to the VA the money, the funds, the resources they need to take care of veterans. You know, a fiscal year in the government starts October 1st of each year. 18 out of the last 19 budget or fiscal years, the VA has not received their budget on time. They've not received it on October 1st. Oftentimes, it's 5 months into the fiscal year. Just imagine, if you will, how you would run a household or a budget, how you would pay for school, how would you pay for classes, if you didn't know, number one, when you were going to get your money, or number two, how much money you would be getting. You couldn't do it, a business couldn't do it, a household can't do it, the Department of Veterans Affairs should not be expected to do it. This work has recommendations in there that takes that funding mechanism and puts it into a place where the VA would be funded sufficiently, they would be funded timely, and they would be funded with some predictability about the amount of funds they would get in order to take care of the people they have to take care of. That, if that were the only thing that would come out of this book and its work regarding the VA, it would be monumental as far as veterans are concerned. The other thing I would mention to you, and then I'll stop on the second point, is the disability system. Fundamentally, the disability system has been in place since 1945. It's been tweaked, it's been reformed, it's been revised, it's still behind the times. Fundamentally, it works. The process itself is so flawed that they should throw it out and start all over again. This work that has been done takes a notice of that, recognizes that, and addresses it in a very, very proactive way that would, we believe, as an organization, and we've been doing this kind of work for almost 90 years now, although not personally, knows how the system works, how it should work. This is a radical change that they're recommending, but it's a change that we think is one that is workable, that would simplify the system, would speed up the system, and get into the hands of veterans the benefits they've so rightfully earned by their service and their sacrifice. You read almost daily about the perils of some of these veterans who are severely disabled, some single, some with families who are homeless, who are, the suicidal rate of this cohort, this generation of veteran, is much greater than any other period before it. And you have to ask yourself why. It's the nature of the war, it's the nature of the business, it's the nature of the circumstances and the environment, but it's also coming home to a nation that we didn't come home to, that honored our service, but the benefits cannot be delivered in an adequate and a timely way. And I would just ask you, the next generation of leaders in this nation, if that's something that you think is acceptable. I mean, there are certain things the federal government should do and must do. Disabled veterans are nothing more than a continuation of the cost of war that our government and our foreign policy issues get us into, and that should be a #1 priority, in our opinion, or my opinion, as far as a nation's obligation. I would close by, again, not only recognizing but applauding this work, which I think is going to set the stage for a blueprint of needed, meaningful, and workable reforms to the Department of Veterans Affairs that are going to benefit not only the government as an entity, us as taxpayers, but more importantly, disabled men and women who have donned the uniform and come back a little bit less whole than when they went over.
Great. It's a pleasure to be part of a panel. It's so interesting. I'm learning a lot here, so thank you all. Try to add a slightly different perspective. I'm a writer, a journalist, and my work on this issue has mainly been from the perspective of how the press has covered this, how it's been presented to the public, what gets reported, and maybe even more interesting, what doesn't get reported. And I think that bears a lot on some of the issues raised here. The book, which I had a chance to look at briefly leading up to this, is fascinating, as you've heard. And I was particularly interested in Chapter 6, which is on the global consequences. Most of the discussion we've had is on the consequences in the U.S., but the global consequences are particularly interesting. And there were two sections in particular: the cost of Iraqi deaths and injuries, and the cost to Iraq's economy. And inevitably, since the book is mainly about the cost to the U.S., that Joe and Linda were only able to sort of touch on this. But I want to look into this a little bit more, because I think that section in some ways is critical when we talk about the cost of this war. It's costly, of course, financially, costly in terms of blood and treasure, but the cost to Iraq has to be factored into this as well. And I think it's particularly urgent that we look at this because of where we stand at the moment on this issue and the surge and the type of coverage it's gotten and the type of very positive presentation. I mean, just two articles in the last few days in the Washington Post. Charles Krauthammer on Friday had a column, there is simply no denying the remarkable improvements in Iraq since the surge began a year ago. And he takes a few swipes at the Democrats for denying how well things are going. And imagine the transformative effects in the region and indeed in the entire Muslim world of achieving a secure and stable Iraq, friendly to the United States and victorious over al-Qaeda. And he in turn cites this other article, this study that Anthony Cordesman wrote based on a visit that he made there, and he ran a version in the, he's from Brookings, and he ran an article summarizing it in the Washington Post Sunday. No one can return from the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan, as I recently did, without believing that these are wars that can still be won. He goes on to talk about how we have to stay the course. If you look at the fine print down in the article, he does talk about how the military is projecting a need to stay on the battlefield. Their slide shows doesn't end in 2008 or in 2009. They go beyond 2012 and up to 2020 in terms of sustained presence there. But anyway, these types of articles, together with what John McCain is saying on the campaign trail, is leading to this growing sense, and it's changing now in the poll numbers, about how well this war is going. And obviously, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, whoever it is going to be on the defensive, I think, come the campaign. Now, we all will acknowledge that security is improving. I mean, there's no question that Baghdad is a safer place than it was a year ago. But if you look at what this war has done to Iraq, I mean, it's shocking how the debate is able to exclude the cost to Iraq that this war has had. And you just see so little of this. For instance, the middle class has basically has been decimated and more or less destroyed in Iraq. I mean, doctors, teachers, engineers, civil servants, journalists, my profession, they've either been killed, kidnapped, or they've left the country. The destruction of infrastructure has just been remarkable. The decay of hospitals, schools, factories, the transportation network. And then we get to the whole issue of the number of Iraqis who have died. And I think in your book you mentioned there are figures of 100,000, but all those figures are also very much low estimates. If you go to the icasualties.org website, which is sort of the one that people most look at, in February the number of Iraqis who died is 670. Of them, 110 were Iraqi security forces. 551 civilians died in the month. Now, these are gross underestimates. If you go to the site, they say that it's based on press reports, and only a certain number of these deaths get into the press. So basically, 600 people, or if you take the civilian number, 550 civilians are dying every month. Now, that looks good compared to what it was a year ago. After the Samarra bombing, the number of Iraqis dying went up to 2 and almost 3,000. So basically, by people are looking compared to a year ago, and it looks improved. But if you go before the Samarra bombing, it is at the same level. And for any society to think that hundreds and hundreds of people are getting killed every month, what that does, the trauma that it inflicts on a society, the number of families that are continuing to suffer. I mean, the costs dwarf those that we're talking about here. I feel in reading the press the same way I did back in about 2005 when I would read these articles. That was the year when these elections were taking place in Iraq and the people with their thumbprints and so on. And there was a stirring aspect to that. But I would read these articles about the electoral process, about how the political process is improving. And you'd read and you'd flip from the front page onto the jump, and you'd read down into these articles, and you'd start seeing the figure, you know, and X number of bodies showed up on the street, and bombings went off in Kirkuk and in Basra, and so on and so forth. And it was buried in these stories, the level of what was actually happening on a day-to-day basis. And the same thing is going on now. You have to read down in these stories to see just how violent Iraq remains. I want to read to you this. This is a friend of mine who is embedded a lot over there. He gets the press releases from the Multinational Corps, which is the official name for U.S. forces there. This is a very short press release, and the headline is, "Escalation of Force Results in Death of Iraqi." The dateline is Diyala, Iraq. An Iraqi citizen was killed during an escalation incident February 27th in the area of Diyala. The Iraqi citizen was approaching coalition forces on foot, wearing a bulky jacket with his hands in his pockets. The CF Patrol, I'm not sure, it's Coalition Force Patrol, enacted security measures to prevent the civilian from approaching them. A search of the man was conducted, but no weapon was found. Coalition forces were not injured during the incident. The incident is under investigation. So basically, this is a civilian, unarmed, killed at a checkpoint. Escalation of force results in death of Iraqi. It does not say the U.S. killed this person. It's this Orwellian language that goes on. And this is going on every day, these types of incidents. They do not make it. This was not in the Times today. It was not in most papers. I did an article recently about a blog that McClatchy News runs. McClatchy used to be Knight Ridder. They distinguished themselves for their reporting before the war because they challenged sort of the Bush administration's argument about WMD and other parts of their argument. And they've continued to be sort of very independent-minded in their coverage. And they have a blog so that their Iraqi staff, you know, it's so dangerous now for the press that American news organizations rely a lot on their Iraqi reporters. And they have a blog where these Iraqis can write about what their day-to-day life is. And I recommend you go to it because it's really interesting. It's called Inside Iraq. And in the course of it, I was in touch with the McClatchy bureau chief. It's a very enterprising, courageous young woman named Lila Fadl. And she was just telling me, well, you know, we've just been hearing about these incidents. There was a young boy on a bus who was killed, caught in a crossfire incident. A family in Fallujah that our Fallujah reporter knows, U.S. troops fired into the house. They thought there were insurgents. There weren't. Several people in the family were killed. They had an incident in which the father of one of the McClatchy reporters, Iraqi reporters, was arrested in one of the hundreds of raids that continue to go on in Baghdad that our forces are carrying out. And he was wrongly arrested, and he spent months in a detention center. And the only reason that they got him out was because she, Lila, and McClatchy were able to use all their prestige and resources to get the U.S. forces to release this man. And so I said to her, Lila, this is incredible, all these incidents and what happened and what you had to do to get the father of one of your Iraqi reporters out. Did you write this up? She says, no, I was going to, but by the time we got him out, there's so much going on in this country, we can't begin to report on all these things. I'm going to wrap up quickly, but security is obviously part of it. She told me that they have a 20-minute rule. If you go out for 20 minutes and do interviewing, by that time, word starts to spread in the neighborhood, and people will they will notice a foreigner is in the neighborhood, and your life can, you can become a target. So it's very hard to get out and corroborate a lot of these things, but there's so much more to it. And I think ultimately, the two things that limit the coverage of this are, A, indifference on the part of the American public. We're interested in our own people and what's happening, and rightly so, but the amount that's happening to the Iraqis, I just get a sense that Americans have lost interest. And there are the limits of tolerance of what the public, what they will bear listening to. Because American troops doing these things, it's a very uncomfortable thing. My view is that all militaries end up wars where civilians always get harmed the most. And it's very difficult to write about your own troops doing this. So I think that while the press tests this and run these type of stories, there's a limit to what can be done. So in this vacuum, we get these accounts like these articles by Charles Krauthammer and these reports by this Brookings analyst or John McCain on the campaign trail. And because this information is not being kept in front of the public, the cost of the war to the Iraqi people, we can claim that things are improving so much and we just have to hold the course. So I'd like to end by suggesting to Joe and Linda, if they need another project, that their Chapter 6 is an excellent beginning for looking at the cost to what's going on into Iraq, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that maybe you can look to fill in. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby, Dave, and Michael, for a very interesting set of comments on the book. I'd like to just take a few minutes to provide a few broad observations as well. You might ask what I'm doing up here, someone from Goldman Sachs on this panel. Actually, Joe and I have known one another for a long time, and I have been interested in the topic for a while. Actually, I have done a book. It's not as long as Linda's and Joe's. It's called The Price of Liberty, Paying for America's Wars. And it approaches this from a somewhat different angle. It looks at the history of paying for our wars from the Revolution to the current war on terror. And one of the things that we discussed in this hearing that we participated in this morning at the Joint Economic Committee is how different this war is from other wars in the way it has been financed. And I'd just like to take 2 minutes to explain this a little bit and put this in context. A month after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt went before Congress in 1942 to give his State of the Union speech. And he said the following. He said, war costs money, and that means taxes and bonds and taxes. It means we have to give up luxuries, and it means we have to give up ordinary things that we're otherwise used to. And this was, in effect, a call to Americans to sacrifice that while American troops were on the battlefield, Americans should be making some sacrifices at home. This war is very different in that the troops have been making enormous sacrifices. Their families, as Bobby and Dave have discussed, have been making enormous sacrifices as well. But what has gone on the home front? Basically, what's happened, and this distinguishes this war from every other war in our history, is during this war, we have had a tax cut, as Joe has pointed out. Every other war, we've had a tax increase to help pay for the war. This war, we've had increases, substantial increases in domestic spending. In every other major war, we've had cuts in domestic spending to make room in the budget to pay for the war. This war has been financed entirely by supplementals, what are called emergency supplementals, which circumvent, which skirt the normal budget process, so you do not have trade-offs between war spending and other kinds of spending. This is not given the same scrutiny as other wars in the way it's been financed. And as Joe and Linda both pointed out, it's financed entirely by borrowing, but the big difference is 40% of the money borrowed comes from abroad. It's the Chinese and the Middle Easterners and the South Koreans and the Russians and people who hold U.S. Treasury bills and notes and bonds who are financing 40% of this war. This has only happened once in American history, and it happened during the Revolution, when the United States government, which was not even a government then, it was the Continental Congress, had to borrow money from France and from the Netherlands. Very important differences that make this war quite distinct from others. The second is that in every other major war, before you go into the war or at the outset of the war, it tends to look cheap. And it tends to be that most leaders will say it's going to be a cheap and short war. Civil War, they thought of that way at the outset. World War I, they believed that to be the case at the outset. Same with Vietnam. Not World War II. They understood that would be a long war. But those three major wars, they anticipated would be short and cheap. But when they figured out that the war was going to be more expensive, there was a national dialogue on how you pay for it. Whether you borrow all of it or you borrow none of it. And what tended to be the case was during the Civil War, Secretary of Treasury Chase, after dialogue with the Congress, decided that he would pay a quarter of the price with taxes, 3/4 through borrowing. In World War I, the Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, who incidentally was the guy who started the path tunnels, they were called McAdoo tunnels at the time, he decided that we should pay 1/3 of this through taxes and 2/3 through borrowing. And Secretary Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury during World War II, 50% paid for by taxes, 50% would be paid for by borrowing. They had this dialogue. This war is very interesting because it's been paid all by borrowing, as we've indicated, and there was no dialogue. There was no dialogue on what programs would be given up to pay for the war. There was no dialogue on whether we should increase taxes to pay for the war. There was no dialogue in the Congress or in the country, in part because you had a Republican president and a Republican Congress. But in other circumstances where you've had the same party control the White House and the Congress, there has been a dialogue. There has been a dialogue on how you spend money more efficiently. During World War II, there was something called the Truman Commission. He held hearings on wartime waste and saved the country about $15 billion and made the whole war more credible because it was clear to Americans that there was an oversight process. There has been no oversight process. The role of the Congress in providing oversight to avoid these kind of abuses simply didn't exist during this war. The Congress and the President were in lockstep, and the American people were not represented by the Congress in watching over, playing that watchdog role over the executive branch. And the last point I'd like to make it goes to the broader point again of sacrifice. It is a critical element, it has been a critical element of American wartime policy from the beginning, that Americans, when their troops are fighting abroad, make some sacrifices at home. That it's not just the troops and their families, it's people at home. It's people at home giving up something in terms of government programs that are cut back, in terms of tax increases, in terms of, in World War II, you had rationing, you had price controls, you had wage controls. This war, and the quote that sticks in my mind most is after 9/11, the President said, instead of asking people for sacrifice to pay for the war on terror, he said, go out and spend. Well, we've spent a lot, and Joe's indicated that a lot of that spending has been based on borrowing. So we really don't have this kind of sacrifice at home, and particularly for the veterans. And this is the point that I think we can find general agreement on. I would like to see, and I think others would like to see, upper income people pay at least some kind of surcharge, some kind of tax over what they pay now, because these veterans are going to require collectively over the period of the next 20 to 30 years billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars for their health care, and this is all unfunded. There's no funds available. There are no funds available for this. And at some point, the public, whether one is violently in favor of the war or violently opposed to the war, this is, I think, the moral thing to do. And we're going to have to pay for it one way or another. We may as well do it in an upfront and as generous a way as we can. This war, it turns out, in the end, this war that we thought would be, or at least we were told would be short and we were told would be cheap, is now the second longest running war in American history. Longer than World War II. Not as long as Vietnam, which lasted a lot longer, but has lasted longer than World War II. And it's the second most expensive war in American history, World War II being the most expensive. But we've not thought about how to pay for it. There has not been a national dialogue about how to pay for it. And one of the things that we can do as a result of this book and the kind of conversations we're having here is to have more conversations with the American people. If we go to war again, or if we continue this war, are there better ways of paying for it? And at least to understand, because this is a war of choice, at least to understand what we're giving up, what the, as economists call it, what the opportunity costs are in continuing this war. This may not be a decisive factor whether we should or should not continue it, but a democracy functions best when the public is informed. An informed electorate is critical to a well-functioning democracy for the reasons that many panelists have indicated. Americans have not been informed to the degree they should be about the cost of this war, about how it's being paid for, and if we were, we would have at least a number of ideas about how to do it better, and we would at least avoid some of the pitfalls that we've experienced during this war if, heaven forbid, we have to go to war again. We need to learn a lot of lessons to improve the way we pay for this war, and certainly to prepare ourselves for the future. So on that note, let me open the floor to anyone who would like to raise a question, or if you have a particular point that you'd like to make quickly, you're welcome to make those points. Who would like to begin? There's a microphone right there, so step right up, line up to the microphone, and we will call on you. Yes, please.
Yes, good evening. I actually would like to direct my comment to Mr. Massing. You quoted 100,000 dead of Iraqi civilians, and I'd just like to raise your attention to two household surveys that were conducted by Les Roberts at Columbia University and Gilbert Burnham at Johns Hopkins that say that on average 650,000 Iraqi civilians have died a violent death. And I think that the 100,000 number that you quoted dwarfs significantly the findings from these two surveys that were published in The Lancet.
Yes, I'm certainly aware of those, and I appreciate the point. I was citing a figure that is in the book, which is clearly a low figure. You know, it's at least that. In doing the article I did about the McClatchy thing, you know, one of the reporters I talked to just referred to 1 million she thought could be dead. I mean, the numbers are fantastic, and yes, those studies suggested it could be much higher than that.
Can I just make one comment? Those studies talked about 600,000 through June 2006. So if you update it to now, the numbers are much larger, almost surely, because 2007 was the most violent year of the war.
And did you use those stats in your book?
Yeah, we did talk about it. There was another study that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that talked about a somewhat smaller number. But in looking at the, they focused on the number of violent deaths. But if you read the article carefully and you look at what's sometimes called the excess deaths, you look at and compare the death rate before the war and the death rate afterwards, it's often difficult to tell what is caused by the war because half the doctors have been killed or left the country. Without electricity, you can't get medicines, many of the kinds of medicines. If you look at the total numbers implicit in that study, again, through the same period, June 2006, the number is somewhat smaller than the 600. It's about 450,000, but still is is much larger than the number of 100,000.
Good evening. My name is Alexander De Filippi, and my question is for any of you or all of you at the same time. I truly believe we are living through one of the darkest ages in this country, in the history of this country. I believe George Bush has taken the country back dozens of years in terms of freedom, have violated our freedom of expression and our right in many ways. And also, it's related to national security, my question. The Congress, the House, is opposing to FISA, to the extension of FISA for, I guess, for another year, I don't know, or permanent extension of FISA. So
you should explain what FISA is to people who don't know. It's the surveillance that
it's
goes
a
on.
surveillance act,
right, just so people will know.
that authorize the government, authorize the private company, telephone company, to keep records of all of us, any of us.
Right.
So my question, if a citizen has information about this illegal surveillance, these illegal operations, and it becomes a target of the Secret Services, how can that person provide that information to Congress or to the proper agency?
Michael, do you want to talk about FISA? You probably have dealt with it.
I really...
You know, who would like to discuss this?
Bobby, do you want to talk?
Okay, Bobby. Go for it.
You're screwed. That's just a fact. We live in a time that is unrecognizable to people, you know, that came of age, you know, decades ago. We got involved in a case with a soldier recently that I think is, you know, it's its own example. Here's a guy who had come back from Iraq, had heavy combat, mentally was shot, and the long and the short of it was the military, after all sorts of hassles, including, you know, a New York Times involvement, major profile on the kid, you know, finally said, okay. And they agreed to give him a disability, 40%. You're going to be out of the military, you're going to get medical care, you're going to get a disability, et cetera. 3 days before that, he leaves. This is Fort Carson. Apparently, he was having an issue with his sergeant, and he told his family, I'm going to kill this guy or I'm going to kill myself, and I'm just leaving. 3 days away from having his ticket punched. Disability, medical care, the whole, so something was wrong on the face of it. He, like so many other soldiers, you know, winds up months later getting involved with the authorities down in Florida. They run a check, routine, and they say, this guy's left the military, and the military considers him a deserter. We have no recourse but to arrest the guy. The guy goes into jail, and we get involved because family calls us. This guy cannot get access to an attorney. ACLU can't get involved because there are no, you know, civil charges here. This is a federal issue, and the Army wants him. We got to hold him. He can't get brought before a judge. This guy is weeks in a jail in this country. Soldier, medical problems, mental health conditions, cannot access an attorney, cannot access a judge, and languishes in the jail with absolutely no rights, as though he was a terrorist, for God's sakes. We run a media campaign. We get the Miami Herald involved. NPR, National Public Radio, calls the Pentagon and speaks to the Pentagon spokesperson. And they say, look, what don't you understand? We're involved in a war. We don't have time to deal with issues like this. Even with all the things that we've been reading about and the loss of civil liberties in this country, you know, habeas corpus being challenged the way it's been, these are stunning examples. I will tell you one more very, very quick story. I led the first group of American veterans to return to Vietnam after the war. I was the president of the National Organization for Vietnam Veterans of America, and we'd finally come into our own in the 80s. And I wound up pissing off Ronald Reagan because I challenged a lot of the involvements in Central America and other things. And lo and behold, I wound up having a campaign that was launched against me. I cannot to this day tell you who was involved. There were break-ins to my apartment. There were wiretaps on the phone. I'd go back and forth between New York City and Washington, D.C. I'd be on the phone in Washington, D.C. in my apartment. I'd hang up. My wife would call me in less than a minute and say, this is who you're on the phone with. This is the conversation you were having. Because somebody would get on the phone to her and tell her real-time conversations that I was having, who I was having the conversations with, etc. Well, when there were break-ins, death threats, poison pen letters, notes under the door, approaches on the street, etc., I hired private investigators. They quit. Turned out, I found out years later, they were told to quit because they were doing work for the agencies, and the agency said, if you want to continue to get paid, drop the case with Mueller. Well, I had the good fortune of having a personal relationship, a friendship with Senator John Kerry. And that goes back to when we were active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And at this point, John was not only a senator, but he was the ranking member, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee that was investigating what was going on with the Contras. And what was going on with the Contras and challenging their funding obviously went against the Reagan administration. He had to have investigators that weren't going to be intimidated. So I go to Senator Kerry and I start to lay it out. He says, Bobby, stop. And he calls in the guy who's general counsel to the Foreign Relations Subcommittee, a guy by the name of Jack Blum, very, very well known in intelligence circles. And they go on and explain to me, this is in the mid-'80s, that there was a lot more of this kind of stuff going on than was being publicly reported. A lot of the Central American peace organizations were infiltrated. There was all sorts of crap that was going on. And John picked up the phone and called the deputy director of the FBI, a guy by the name of Bucky Revelle. And he said, I've got a friend, and he's got some problems, and I'd appreciate it if you'd look into it. So the next day, I go over with the counsel to the committee, Jack Blum, other Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, and I meet with this guy, Bucky Revelle, for an hour and a half, laying out all the kinds of stuff that's going on. Okay, we're going to put agents on your case. We're going to put traps on the phones in New York and Washington, yada, 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 yada. As we leave the building, Jack turns to me and he says, Bobby, Kerry's been owed a chit by the intelligence community. He didn't explain why. And the terms of the chit was that when he called it in, whatever could be done to resolve that problem would be taken care of. And Jack said, Bobby, you got to know that John called that chit in for you. And if what happened to you stops today, we can't hold anybody accountable to find out what went on here because the trail would have ended. And I said, Jack, I understand. I just need it to stop. As of that day, it stopped. Okay? Now, I give you that as an example of, this is going back a ways into the mid-'80s. But what it did for me was it made me nostalgic for the Nixon days. Because back in the Nixon days, you had guys like Attorney General John Mitchell. You had protests in Washington, arrest them all. All right? You had a problem with the Black Panthers, boom, knock down the front door, go in and shoot them. Everybody understood the game. What's happened now is, particularly with the technologies and information systems, et cetera, it's become very, very sophisticated. There is no privacy in this country. People need to understand that. The question isn't trying to hold on to privacy. It's how are we going to manage the access to all the information that is out there today. So what I'm saying to you is at least it's being talked about and acknowledged in terms of the degree of government intrusion into the private lives of people, the loss of civil liberties. And when I say to you, pal, you're screwed if that's going on with you, I mean it. I had the very good fortune of having a good friend as a senator of the United States who was in a position to call in a chit with the intelligence agencies, and that's what stopped it for me. We've got a big problem in this country.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Good evening. First, thanks to Mr. Mueller and Mr. Gorman for your service and your work on behalf of veterans currently. My question is with regards to a potential American withdrawal, and I don't kind of want to make a judgment as to whether that's a good or bad thing, but what the cost related to that might be. Analysts today see this al-Sadr ceasefire and the U.S. arming these Sunni CLCs in the west of Iraq as sort of what's holding together the security right now. And they believe that should the United States withdraw, what's likely to happen is these groups will, clash with each other. And that the civil war will open up and become even worse and perhaps become more of a regional conflict. And my question is, what do you think the impacts would be on the global economy and the Iraq economy should that outcome occur, particularly for oil markets?
We'll need to keep our answers brief because we don't have much time, and we've got 5 people who want to answer questions. Who would like to? That's all right. It was great.
Okay. Let me try to answer very briefly, which is, in the book we ask we try to describe the right way of thinking about the answer to that question, and it's not whether just whether there's going to be more chaos or less chaos when we leave. And there's a debate about that. Most Iraqis think things will be better if we leave. But the question is, what will be the difference between the level of chaos or the level of stability if we leave now and if we leave in, say, 4 years? And is it worth spending another $1.5 trillion to get that probably small increment or decrement in the level of stability? And I think one of the reasons why a lot of people think we ought to leave is we're going to be spending an awful lot probably to get very little.
I'd just like to add one quick thing. I mean, I think that's a very good question because I do think that a withdrawal could very easily lead to a much worse situation. I think that basically U.S. forces now are in between Sunni and Shia forces, and that's the only thing that's keeping a damper. And so I'm under no illusion about what could happen, and that is the huge dilemma that we as a country face. And I don't know the way out, and I think what Joe is sort of saying is that, like, we can either pull the plug now and go through that or wait a number of years and go through it. But either way, it's not a very enviable situation.
And if I could add one thing to that as well, just this afternoon before I came down here from Cambridge, I had a former student walked into my office who was a Navy SEAL, and he was just back yesterday from 9 months in Iraq. And he came in, he wanted to talk to me about his experiences, and he was a very good student. This is his second tour in Iraq, and he was telling me that he was in charge of his group of people in Anbar province, where, as you know, the Navy SEALs do some of the most risky, most difficult work. He described basically 18, 20-hour days, week after week after week after week for 9 months. He said he basically not slept in 9 months. Anyway, he described a lot of difficult situations. They lost a lot of guys. It was a very, very grueling thing. But he said that that last month he had personally captured the number 2 Al-Qaeda in Iraq guy in Anbar province, which was, it's a huge thing. And then we talked about, he said, well, I said, well, what happened to him? And he said, well, that's the problem, Professor. He said, I got him. And he said, I risked my life and I risked 14, lives to get him. It was a very risky operation. But now we'll be lucky if we keep him for a year before he goes free again. With my signature, I can, in theory, have him locked up for 3 years, but actually, we'll have him for a couple of months for questioning. After that, he'll go to the Iraqi authorities, then he'll bribe his way out. He'll be out on the streets before you know it. And he said that it really makes me question, whether strategically we're kind of doing the right thing here, because this keeps happening.
I promised everyone will be out by 10. Why don't we take 2 more questions, and then the panelists will be around for a couple minutes for those who would like to answer questions. So next 2, and then, but hang around afterwards because we'll still stay here. Please.
My question sort of centers on the economic costs, I guess, a little bit, what you may or may not have found from your research. Right now, certainly among the leading Republican presidential candidates, there's been no serious discussion, as far as I can tell, of actually paying for the war. They advocate continuing the fiscal policies of the previous administration and are clearly very for the war. But the Bush administration itself, and Mr. Hormats, you would be well aware of this, certainly, have brought in extremely experienced economists at all levels of government, and yet, as far as I'm aware, at least in regards to a public discussion, there's been almost no change in policy at all. They've banked everything on the economy to try to end the deficits, and here we are again, and they're mounting. And I'm curious, was there that kind of smoking gun that they seemed to have pre-September 11th, where there were discussions that were being ignored, or has it been completely overlooked? And why have very accomplished economists not been able to change the dialogue?
Do you want to start, Joe?
Well, let me just make one remark, which is it's quite clear they don't want to have a dialogue. And the fact is that the administration responded very critically to our book this morning. And so we obviously are getting on their nerves that they don't want this discussion. The reason is quite clear, is they wanted to make the American people believe they could have a war for free. The sort of the economists' guns and butter trade-off they wanted to repeal. And was interesting this morning in the hearing, Ron Paul, a Republican, was very critical. He was making this point too. He said we ought to be financing this. We ought to have a discussion of this. And the Senator Schumer invited. The OMB was very critical of some numbers that came out from the CBO. That is, the administration was very critical of the numbers that came out from the CBO and the Joint Economic Committee. So Schumer asked the head of the OMB to come down and testify and say, okay, tell us what your numbers are so we can have a discussion. And so far, they refused.
Yeah. Let me just add one other point to that, to what Joe said. After 9/11, the argument was 9/11 changed everything. Well, on fiscal policy, it essentially changed nothing. We're in a post 9/11 world with a pre 9/11 fiscal policy framework for deciding on taxes and spending. You'd think after 9/11 spending on non-security things would go down, so you'd have more money to spend on national security, particularly homeland security. Didn't happen. You'd think there would be maybe a tax increase or an energy policy to reduce energy dependence after 9/11. Didn't happen. And there was really, there was an attempt to, I think, protect the administration from the potential criticism that they thought might take place if they were to go to the American people and say, you're going to have to pay for this war. If you want a war, you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to give up something. None of that happened. This has been a war without a dialogue on the costs, the opportunity costs, the fact that it should have changed the way fiscal policy was conducted. It didn't change it. It certainly didn't change it in the right way. And even to this date, as Joe's pointed out, there is not the kind of robust dialogue that you should have when a country goes to war and has been in a war for 5 years.
I also just want to add that they're also very tricky. If you look at what they've done with the veterans budget this year, for example, for the FY 2009 budget, ostensibly they're increasing the budget by $5 billion. But if you look at the fine print, they're actually increasing fees on disabled veterans by $3 billion, which means they're only increasing it by $2 billion, which is below the cost of living increase, so they're actually cutting the veterans budget. And you may want to comment on this, Dave. I mean, they're very tricky, and the more you look into it, the more you see this pattern, which we found throughout the book, of sort of trickery and deception.
Okay, let's go to the last question, then we can, if people want to come up afterwards, we'll do that, but some people perhaps want to go home.
Hi, my question is very specific about a statistic that was given at the beginning of the presentation. I believe that you said that the costs of the war has gone from $4 billion a month to $12 billion a month. I was wondering what exactly goes into that statistic. I mean, are you talking about medical coverage as well? And why you think the costs have increased so much?
What goes into that? That is just the cost of combat operations. That's the cost of basically moving people around, keeping people deployed over there, paying not regular salaries, but paying extra combat pay. For example, reservists normally would get paid one weekend a month, but they get paid full-time salary plus, living stipends if they're, in war. So it's all of those sort of running costs. Now, if you look at what, why has the cost gone up so much? This is, of course, one of the, big questions of the war. I mean, there are, you would think that the main reason is because of larger numbers of troops. But in fact, there has been an increase in the number of troops who are deployed, and that accounts for some of it, but it accounts for a fairly small percentage of the overall increase in cost. The overall increase has been driven by a huge increasing reliance on contractors, a huge increase, of course, in fuel consumption and fuel costs, which affect the military extensively, a huge increase in the number of repairs and replacements that have had to be done. Now, equipment is basically being used up at 10 times the peacetime rate, and we're not replacing it at anything close to that, but we are replacing some. So the replacements and the repairs that are being done are very, very expensive. We are also spending a very large amount now on training Iraqi forces, training Iraqi police. And when you look at the functions that the military is doing, our military is now acquired every year sort of more and more functions. We have the fighting al-Qaeda function. We have the sort of preventing a civil war between Sunni and Shia function. We have the constructing bases function. There is the protecting the oil facilities function. There is the finding insurgency function. There are the various functions of rebuilding and repairing, working with governmental units, and so on and so forth. There are 5 or 6 different functions, and those have sort of mounted, and there have been sub-functions added. So the number of different things combined with the number of different places where our folks are deployed, the fuel, the repairs, and the contractors have really driven up the cost.
Thank you very much. Let me first, before I conclude, thank Sharon Cleary and Rebecca Hogan, who really were instrumental in pulling this together. Thank you in the audience for your participation and for your attention, and thank a terrific panel for some very, very thoughtful observations. Thank you very much.